In the cold, snow-covered wilderness, there lived a creature with the form of a woman, but the spirit of a fox. Her fur was a soft shade of orange, and her ears were sharp, like the tips of a fox's. Her name was Vila, and she was a Vulpine, a species known for their agility, intelligence, and strength. Vila's home was a small hut, nestled between tall, silent trees, surrounded by the endless snow of a world that had grown colder each passing day. She had a cub, no older than a few months, whose tiny form clung to her chest for warmth. The cub was just beginning to grow into its own, with fur as soft as snowflakes and eyes as bright as stars in the night sky. They were both all that was left of her family. Her tribe had been wiped out by a merciless enemy, a race of beings from the skies. These enemies, known only as the Hunters, came without warning, descending from the heavens in their great metal ships. They had attacked without mercy, driven by their need to take what was not theirs. Vela had been lucky to escape their wrath, but it had come at a terrible cost. She had lost everything she knew and loved. Her survival in the cold was an everyday struggle. The blizzards made it impossible to track any form of prey for food. Every day was spent fighting to keep warm and protect her cub. She had wrapped her baby in layers of her own fur, trying to keep him safe from the freezing winds that seemed to never stop. The thought of the Hunters finding her again haunted her, but she tried not to think about it. Her cub needed her now, more than ever. It was a bitter, lonely existence. Yet, Vila had never once thought of giving up. She knew that her life was intertwined with the cub's, and she would do anything to keep him safe. One cold night, as the howling winds battered her small hut, she heard something she had hoped would never happen again. The ground trembled beneath her, a deep vibration that could only mean one thing. The Hunters were back. Vila stood up quickly, her heart pounding. She grabbed her cub, holding him close to her chest as she crouched down, peering out of the small window. Far in the distance, the light of a large ship appeared, its cold, artificial glow cutting through the darkness of the night. Her breath caught in her throat. The ship was enormous, far larger than any she had seen before. It seemed to hover, suspended in the air, casting a shadow over the land beneath it. There was no place to run, no place to hide. Vila knew that her time was running out. In that moment, all the strength that had kept her going for so long seemed to leave her. She realized that she might not survive this. She might not make it through the night. She looked down at her cub, his innocent eyes wide and unaware of the danger. Wave of sadness flooded over her. She had failed. The cub would be taken, just like the others. The thought of what the Hunters might do to him made her heart ache. She held him tighter, whispering softly in his ear as if to tell him everything would be okay. But deep inside, she knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. As she stepped away from the window, ready to face whatever fate awaited her, something unexpected happened. The ship that hovered in the sky began to descend, much slower than she anticipated. The light grew stronger, almost blinding. And then, just before the ship's engines roared to life, a figure emerged from the shadows. The figure was tall, human-like, but not entirely human. The man had the look of someone who had walked through many battles. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and his skin was pale, almost metallic. He moved with an air of authority, and Vila could feel the tension in the air as he walked toward her. She tensed, her claws ready to strike at any moment. But the man did not attack. Instead, he knelt down, his gaze softening when he saw the cub in her arms. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The man's eyes met Vila's, and there was an understanding between them, something neither of them could explain. The hunter, the protector, and the prey were no longer so different after all. Vila's heart raced, every instinct urging her to flee. But she could not move. Her feet felt frozen in place as she stared at the strange figure who had appeared from the shadows. The man was tall, with skin that shimmered under the light of the descending ship. His clothes were dark, tight-fitting, and his presence alone seemed to absorb the cold around him, as if he were a living force of warmth in this frozen world. For a long moment, neither spoke. The winds howled outside, but inside the small hut, everything was silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Vila's eyes narrowed, scanning every detail of the stranger. His eyes deep and glowing with an unsettling otherworldly hue held a strange mixture of weariness and kindness. His hands, though strong and scarred, held no weapon. She couldn't understand it. Why had he not attacked? What was he doing here, standing so calmly in front of her, in the midst of the greatest danger she had known? Her thoughts raced, but she made no move to strike. She held her cub even closer, as though he might vanish if she let go. The cub was starting to squirm in her arms, sensing her unease. The stranger took another step forward, slow and deliberate, as if testing the air between them. When he spoke, his voice was calm but filled with an authority that sent a chill down her spine. "You are not alone," he said, his words in a language she did not fully understand but could feel the meaning. "OF." His tone was not threatening, nor was it soft. It was simply real. Vila's instincts screamed for her to run. Every fiber of her being told her that this man, whatever he was, could not be trusted. And yet, something about him, perhaps his eyes or the way he had spoken, told her there was more to his presence than mere danger. She tilted her head slightly, her sharp fox-like ears flicking toward him. She was calculating, assessing. He didn't look like the hunters, but he certainly didn't look like any ally she'd ever known either. "Why are you here?" she finally asked, her voice trembling slightly, not just from fear, but from the cold. The stranger's gaze softened, and he crouched lower to the ground, bringing himself to her level. He slowly extended his hand, palm open, as if to show he meant no harm. "I came to help," he said simply. "I have been following the hunters, watching them learning their ways. You do not need to face them alone." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Vela didn't know what to make of them. Help? Was there truly such a thing in a world that had been torn apart by ruthless invaders? Could this man, this stranger, truly be offering aid to a Vulpine, a creature of her kind who had been hunted to near extinction? But the truth was undeniable. The ship in the sky was close now, closer than ever before. It would land soon, bringing with it an army of hunters who had no mercy. There would be no escape. A strange feeling began to spread in Vela's chest, a feeling she hadn't known in a long time. Hope. The tiny spark of hope that had been buried deep within her for so long began to flicker. She didn't know if she could trust this man, but she had no choice. The time for questioning had passed. She glanced down at her cub, who was now snuggling into her chest, his small hands clutching at her fur for comfort. She could not let anything happen to him. Not now, not ever. For a moment, the stranger's eyes met hers again, and in that instant, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding. There was no time for hesitation. They were bound by the same enemy, by the same fight for survival. And Vela knew she could not face this battle alone. "I need your help," Vela finally said, her voice steady despite the fear that still gnawed at her. She lowered her gaze, gripping her cub tightly, her claws pressing against his soft fur. "They will be here soon." The stranger nodded, a silent promise in his gaze. "Then we will fight together." Without another word, he stood up, moving with fluidity and precision, as though he had been trained for such moments his entire life. His movements were almost unnatural, like a predator preparing for its final strike. But he wasn't a hunter at least not in the traditional sense. Vala could feel that. He was something different, something more. The cub squirmed in her arms once again, sensing the rising tension. The stranger took a step back, giving her space to gather her thoughts. But Vila's eyes remained locked on him. She had no idea who he was, where he had come from, or what his true intentions were. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. He was her only chance. The ship continued to descend. The sound of its engines grew louder, vibrating through the very ground beneath them. The battle for survival had begun, and it would take everything Vela had to protect her cub and herself from what was about to come. The winds outside howled, but inside the small hut, the silence was suffocating. Vela could feel the weight of the stranger's presence beside her, but she dared not look away from the window. She could already see the shadows of the ship growing, larger against the backdrop of the swirling snowstorm. It was no longer a distant threat. It was an imminent danger, right on her doorstep. The stranger moved with quiet efficiency, his steps light but purposeful as he prepared for the battle to come. He didn't waste time speaking, as if he knew exactly what needed to be done. Vela, though wary of him, found herself following his lead. He had offered help, and right now, that was all she had. The situation left no room for hesitation. If they were to survive, they would have to face the hunters together. Vela felt the cub stir in her arms, his soft breath warm against her chest. She had to keep him safe. That was all that mattered now. Her body trembled, both from fear and the cold. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had known fear before, but this was different. This was the kind of fear that gripped you in the pit of your soul, the kind that whispered, "You are not enough." The stranger paused near the door, his eyes scanning the room, before he turned to Vela. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They've already started landing. It won't be long before they come looking for you." Vela nodded, her thoughts racing. Where could they go? The snowy wilderness outside offered little shelter. But then she remembered the old cave system near the river. It had once been a refuge for her people, a place where they could hide if the need ever arose. It was far from perfect, but it was their best chance now. "I know where to go," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. "Follow me." With one last glance at the window, Vela moved swiftly toward the back of the hut, the cub still cradled in her arms. The stranger followed without hesitation, his steps quiet, his eyes ever watchful. They passed through the dark interior of the hut, the floor creaking under their weight, and reached the back door. As they stepped outside, the bitter cold hit Vela like a slap to the face. The snow had begun to fall heavier, the thick flakes swirling in the fierce wind, but she didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, her legs strong despite the exhaustion that weighed her down. The stranger, without a word, kept pace beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. They made their way toward the thick forest that lay ahead, the trees offering some shelter from the wind. But Vela knew that the deeper they went, the less likely they were to be spotted by the hunters. Their ships would have sensors, but those sensors would struggle to track them in the dense woods. Vela had barely taken a few steps when the sound of distant engines echoed in the air, growing louder by the second. The ship was landing. The hunters were getting closer. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of the urgency pressing down on them. They had to move faster. They couldn't afford to be caught. As they pushed deeper into the woods, Vela glanced at the stranger. He seemed unfazed by the cold, his focus fixed on the path ahead. She had to admit, there was something almost otherworldly about him, something that made her uneasy. But she pushed the feeling aside. She had no time to question him now. If he was her ally, then she needed him. That was all that mattered. They reached the edge of the forest and the riverbank, where the ancient cave system began. The entrance was hidden, covered in thick vines and snow, almost undetectable to the untrained eye. Vela stepped forward, pulling aside the thick undergrowth to reveal the narrow opening. She motioned for the stranger to follow. Once inside, the cold was replaced by a damp chill, the cave's rocky walls offering little warmth. But it was hidden, and that was all that mattered. The cub, sensing the change in their surroundings, quieted down in her arms, his small face buried against her chest. Vela adjusted her grip on him, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the dark interior of the cave. She wasn't sure how long they could stay here before the hunters found them. They would be searching the woods, and the cave wasn't far enough to guarantee safety. But it was a start. The stranger, too, seemed alert, his eyes flicking around the cave with the same predatory precision Vela had come to expect from someone like him. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We wait here for now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they come, we fight, but we need to be ready." Vela nodded, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. The cub needed her warmth. He needed her protection, and Vela would do whatever it took to keep him safe. She couldn't let the hunters get their hands on him. As the sounds of the distant engines grew fainter, Vela closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. She had no way of knowing how this would end. She had no way of knowing if they would survive the night, but she would fight. She would protect her cub, and she would not let the past claim them both. The enemy had underestimated her once, and they would do so again. In the deep silence of the cave, Vela knew one thing for sure: this war was far from over, and no matter what happened next, she would not go down without a fight. The cave was silent, save for the soft drip of water from the rocky ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the distant echo of rushing water from the river outside. Vela sat against the cold stone wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her cub, keeping him close for warmth and comfort. The stranger paced a few feet away, his eyes scanning the dark entrance, waiting for the first signs of movement from the hunters. The tension in the air was palpable, a suffocating presence that neither of them could escape. The moments stretched on endlessly, the uncertainty hanging like a shadow between them. Vela's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened since the stranger's sudden arrival. Who was he? What was his purpose here? Was he truly here to help, or was he just another enemy, cloaked in the guise of an ally? She had trusted no one in so long. The world had taught her that trust was a luxury she could not afford. Yet, somehow, in the presence of this stranger, something in her stirred, a reluctant hope that perhaps this time, things could be different. She glanced at him again. His eyes flickered toward her, and for the briefest moment, their gazes locked. He was not a man, not in the way she understood. He was something else, something otherworldly. But whether that was a blessing or a curse, she couldn't tell. Her thoughts were interrupted when a sudden movement outside caught her attention. A soft crunch of snow, then another. It was faint, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. The hunters were closer than she had thought. The stranger immediately tensed, his hand reaching for the knife at his side. He had not said a word, but Vela could sense his readiness. He was waiting for the signal, the moment they would both have to fight for their lives. Vela stood slowly, cradling her cub carefully against her chest, and moved toward the back of the cave where the shadows were deepest. She didn't know how many hunters were out there. She could feel their presence creeping closer. She had to stay hidden. If they found her, it was all over. And if they found the cub, her heart clenched at the thought. They would never let him go. The hunters would take him, and she would be powerless to stop it. "Stay close," the stranger said in a low whisper, his voice smooth and steady. "We wait for the right moment." Vela nodded, clutching her cub tighter. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but she pushed them aside. There was no time to second-guess herself now. Survival was all that mattered. The seconds stretched into minutes, the quiet of the cave broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional distant snap of a twig. Vela's ears twitched at every sound, her body tense, ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air stinging her lungs, and then it happened. The quiet crunch of snow outside grew louder. Closer. Vela could hear the faint hum of the hunters' technology as they neared. Their heavy footsteps marked the beginning of the hunt. She could hear their voices now gruff and mechanical, distorted by the thick atmosphere of the wilderness. They were close. Too close. The stranger's eyes flicked toward her, and in that moment, Vela knew. It was time. The fight for their lives had begun. Without a word, he slipped silently into the shadows, his movements fluid and silent, like a predator preparing to strike. Vela took a deep breath and followed, her eyes locked on the entrance of the cave. She knew what she had to do. She had to protect her cub. No matter the cost. The cave's narrow entrance offered them little in the way of escape, but it was their only option. If they could surprise the hunters, if they could use the terrain to their advantage, they might stand a chance. Vela crouched low, her tail swishing in the dark. Her claws itched for action, and her senses were alive with the sounds of the world. Around her, the air felt thick with danger, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on her chest. The first hunter appeared at the entrance, a hulking figure dressed in dark armor, his face obscured by a helmet. He scanned the surroundings, his gaze sweeping over the snow-covered landscape as he took cautious steps forward. He was looking for someone. Vela held her breath, her body coiled tight, ready to spring. She could hear the other hunters behind him, their steps slow and deliberate, as if they were preparing to sweep the area. There were at least 3, maybe more. If she was to make it out of this, they needed to be fast. The stranger didn't hesitate. In an instant, he moved, a blur of motion that was almost too quick for Vela to follow. He was on the hunter in seconds, his movements precise and deadly. The clash of metal echoed through the cave as he disarmed the hunter, knocking him to the ground. Before the hunter could react, the stranger was on him again, his blade flashing in the dim light. The other 2 hunters were on the move now, rushing toward the entrance, but Vela was ready. She wasn't about to let them take her cub. With a low growl, she sprang forward, her claws extending as she charged at the nearest hunter. The battle was quick, brutal, and over in an instant. The hunter fell, his heavy armor unable to withstand the precision of her attack. For a moment, everything went still. The cave echoed with the silence of the aftermath, broken only by the distant howling of the wind outside. Vela's heart pounded in her chest, her breaths coming in short bursts as she looked down at the fallen hunters. But the victory was short-lived. The sound of footsteps grew louder again. More were coming. They had only just begun. Vela knew they couldn't stay here for long. The hunters would return in greater numbers, and this cave would offer no more protection than the snow outside. They had to move. Fast. She turned to the stranger, whose face was now painted with a thin layer of blood. He nodded silently, the unspoken understanding between them clear. They had won this round, but the war was far from over. The sound of the wind howling outside the cave grew louder, but the silence within was deafening. Vela stood, her body tense, her eyes scanning the entrance for any sign of movement. The cave's shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if the very walls were closing in around them. Her heart raced, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins after the brief but brutal skirmish with the hunters. She looked down at the fallen bodies of the 2 hunters, their armored forms now lifeless on the cold stone floor. Her claws were stained with their blood, and her breath came in sharp gasps. The heat of battle had left her body shaking, but she couldn't afford to rest. Not now, not when there was still so much at stake. The stranger was already moving, his body fluid and silent as he checked their weapons and ensured there were no further immediate threats. Vela, still holding her cub close to her chest, could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This fight wasn't over. The hunters would be back, and they wouldn't make the same mistake again. She glanced at the stranger, who seemed unfazed by the violence. He had killed without hesitation, without mercy, just as she had. In that moment, she realized something. They weren't so different after all. Both of them were survivors. Both of them had been forced to become something else to survive in. This broken world. Her thoughts were interrupted by the stranger's voice, low and calm. "We need to keep moving," he said. "There's a way out of here. I've been tracking the hunters for a while now. I know where they're headed. If we want to get out of this alive, we need to stay ahead of them." Vela nodded, her grip on her cub tightening as she followed him deeper into the cave. The passageway twisted and turned, narrow and dark, the walls pressing in on them as they moved further from the entrance. It felt like they were descending into the very bowels of the earth, the cold seeping into their bones. But Vela didn't care. Anything was better than staying where they were. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the only sounds the echo of their footsteps and the faint dripping of water from the cave ceiling. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. But Vela knew they couldn't afford to stop. The longer they stayed in one place, the higher the risk of being found. The stranger led the way with surety, his movements swift and calculated, while Vela remained focused on her cub. She couldn't afford to lose him. She couldn't afford to fail again. The memory of her fallen tribe, her people wiped out in an instant, flashed through her mind. She had no intention of letting that happen to her cub, no matter the cost. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a narrow tunnel that sloped upward. The air here was fresher, less damp, and Vela could feel the temperature rising slightly. Her breath, though still visible in the cold air, didn't sting as much as before. "This way," the stranger whispered, motioning for her to follow him up the sloping tunnel. Vela hesitated for a moment, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. She wanted to ask him more, who he was, what he wanted, what this was all leading to, but there was no time for questions now. Survival was the only thing that mattered. As they climbed, Vela felt the familiar pull of exhaustion starting to creep in. Her limbs were heavy, her body aching from the day's ordeal, but she couldn't stop. Not until they were safe. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a small, open cavern. The air here was crisp, and the sounds of the outside world were muted, as if the cave itself were protecting them from the storm raging above. The stranger turned to her, his expression unreadable. "This is it," he said. "We're safe here. For now." Vela felt a momentary flicker of relief, but it was quickly swallowed by the weight of reality. They were not truly safe. Not yet. The hunters would be searching, and they would not stop until they found her and her cub. She looked at the stranger, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read him. "What now?" she asked. "You said you knew where they were headed. Where are they going? What do you want from me?" The stranger met her gaze, his eyes hard and distant. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind howling in the distance, and the soft dripping of water echoing through the cave. "I want nothing from you," he finally said. "I'm here because I have a reason to be. And right now, that reason is to keep you both alive, but we need to move quickly. The hunters are not the only threat out there." Vela frowned, her instincts kicking in. "What do you mean? What else could be worse than them?" The stranger's eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous flashing across his face. "There are things in this world worse than the hunters. And we're about to find out just how true that is." Vela's blood ran cold. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken danger. She didn't know what the stranger meant, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they were in even greater danger than they had ever imagined. Asterisk. Vela's body tensed as the stranger's words echoed in her mind. Worse than the hunters? What could possibly be worse than the merciless invaders who had already destroyed her people and threatened her cub's life? The stranger stood silent. For a moment, his expression unreadable, as though he were weighing whether or not to reveal the truth. Vela took a step closer, her cub still held tightly in her arms. She could feel the heat of his tiny body, the only warmth in the cold stone cavern. "Tell me," she demanded, her voice steady despite the storm of fear rising inside her. "What are you talking about?" The stranger's eyes met hers, his gaze intense. He seemed to study her for a long moment, as though he were seeing through her. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but laced with a quiet urgency. "The hunters are not alone," he said. "Their mission here, it's not just about conquest. It's about something far older. Something buried beneath this planet's surface. And they won't stop until they find it." Vela felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that the hunters weren't simply after resources. Their brutality, their single-minded destruction, it was clear that there was something else driving them, something far darker, something buried, Vela repeated, her voice shaky. The stranger nodded, a grim look on his face. "Yes, beneath the surface. An ancient power, one that could change the course of everything. They've been searching for it for centuries. Your people, and others, like you, have stood in their way for too long. They want it, and they will burn this entire world to the ground to get it." Vela's mind reeled. The world beneath her feet had always been a mystery, a dark abyss that her ancestors had kept hidden. But to think that the hunters, those ruthless invaders, were hunting not just her people, but something even more dangerous. It was too much to fathom. The stranger's next words shattered the last of her calm. "There's only one way to stop them. But it won't be easy, and it may cost us everything." Vela's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" The stranger took a deep breath and stepped forward, lowering his voice. "The power they seek, it's linked to something. Or someone. Something ancient, something lost. And the only way to stop them is to reach it before they do. You're the key." Vela's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean I'm the key? How could I possibly stop them?" The stranger's eyes softened, and for the first time Vela saw something human in his gaze. "Because you are not just any Vulpine, you are part of something greater. Your people were protectors of the ancient power. And now, it's your turn to protect it. But you will need to make a choice." Vela shook her head, struggling to keep her composure. "I don't understand. What choice?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the small glowing device strapped to his wrist. It hummed softly, pulsing with an eerie, unfamiliar light. "There are two paths before you, Vela. You can let them take the power, and the world will fall to ruin. Or, you can choose to fight with everything you have, with the strength of your people's legacy. But the cost of that choice will be high." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Vela's mind raced, her thoughts tangled in the endless possibilities. She had fought so hard to protect her cub, to survive in this cruel world. But now the fight wasn't just for survival, it was for the very future of the world. She looked down at her cub, his eyes wide and innocent, unaware of the incredible burden placed on his shoulders. She couldn't bear the thought of him being swept into the chaos. She had promised to protect him at all costs, but the stranger was right. The world had already been torn apart. The hunters had already started their march to destruction, and if they succeeded, there would be nothing left. She could not allow that to happen. "I will fight," Vela said, her voice steady. "I will do whatever it takes." The stranger nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good. You are your people's last hope." The air in the cavern seemed to shift as the reality of the situation settled in. There was no going back now. There was no time for doubt. The path before her was unclear, but one thing was certain. The battle was only just beginning. Together, Vela and the stranger would face the hunters. Together, they would uncover the secrets of the ancient power that lay buried beneath the earth. And together, they would decide the fate of the world. As they stepped out of the cavern and into the night, Vila looked up at the sky, her heart pounding. The storm raged above, but beneath the cold, there was a glimmer of something more, something ancient and powerful. And as the stars shimmered overhead, she knew that the journey ahead would be unlike anything she had ever imagined. War was not over. It had only just begun.